bit by bit, this war is absolutely eating into not just the fat, but the basic meat and sinews of the Russian state and social provision. But the point is that tends to be a lagging indicator. So at the moment, Putin is still slightly protected because it's not as if suddenly, bang, hospitals that don't have cleaners sort of have to be closed or whatever. No, it's just that they're just not as good, and people may well have more of a chance of catching MRSA or whatever else. But bit by bit, this is exactly how the Soviet Union slid into dissolution. But I have to say, in keeping with the modern times, it's on fast forward. Soviet Union could basically last 15 years before Gorbachev's attempts at reforms actually doomed it, and quite possibly could have lasted longer if it had a rather different type of leader. This kind of degradation, there's no way that it can go on for 20 years.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for TimesRadio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by Mark Galeotti, Honorary Professor at University College London. He's a highly respected expert in Russian politics and global crime, and is the author of books including Putin's Wars from Chechnya to Ukraine, and also the co-author of the recent book Downfall, Prigozhin, Putin, and the New Fight for the Future of Russia. Mark, always a pleasure. Welcome back.
Oh, glad to be here.
Lots to talk about, as ever. Let's begin with Vladimir Putin's comments last week about revising the Russian nuclear doctrine. For those who aren't aware, what did he say and why is it significant?
Well, it's significant because this doctrine is the sort of the foundational document, really, that says under what circumstances would Russia use its nuclear weapons, which we're clearly all very worried about. And essentially, there has been a review process going on since June, and the upshot of that seems to be that there's some various changes. One of which is that they won't just simply be waiting for a clear nuclear first strike attack on them, but also any kind of mass aerospace attack. Because I suppose, in fairness, we do live in an era in which suddenly drones could be carrying nuclear warheads as much as anything else. And although it's only 4 years, but I mean, the original document was signed in 2020, before the sudden sort of, if you'll excuse the expression, explosion of drone use. So in some ways, that is tidying up. More interestingly is the fact that essentially the Russians have up to now said that they would only use their nuclear weapons either if someone else attacked them with nukes, or else if they faced a massive conventional attack which posed an existential threat to the Russian state. And to be perfectly honest, yes, obviously that could in theory mean NATO, but it also was likely to mean China. Now, though, what they're saying is, even a lesser level of attack by a nation which has conventional weapons alone, if it is backed and supported by nuclear power, could also trigger the use of nukes. And clearly, given the degree to which, Britain, France, but above all the United States are backing Ukraine, people are assuming it's that. And so these are the changes which on the one hand sound a little bit arcane, on the other hand also sound a little bit pointless in that, look, if Putin wants to use nukes, he's going to use nukes. It's not as if anyone is going to say, Vladimir Vladimirovich, this does not fit doctrine. And he'll say, oh, well, fair enough, forget I spoke. So, on one level, it doesn't really matter in an authoritarian regime. But nonetheless, the very fact that he's doing this says something politically. And the fact of the matter is, in one case, it's about another information operation. He knows precisely that whenever he talks about nuclear weapons, we in the West pay attention and get worried, the very fact we're talking about it here and now. But my suspicion is this is also actually about potential future Ukraine, I don't necessarily want to call them end games, but if there is a point in the future where there's a ceasefire, the Russians are holding big chunks of Ukrainian territory, and they want to sort of fix that to their advantage, they may well use this as a way of trying to intimidate Kyiv, or more to the point, Kyiv's Western backers, saying, look, if you break the ceasefire to try and take back territory, and there have been cases, after all, one can go back to Croatia's Operation Storm, where after 5 years in which the Serbs in the former Yugoslavia had created a sort of a fake pseudo-state inside Croatian territory. Croatians spent 5 years building up their forces, making their plans, and then massively launched an attack, taking back this territory. What they're trying to suggest is, you try anything like that, and you might be tiptoeing close to our nuclear threshold.
So do you think this is going to have any impact on the war in Ukraine?
Here and now, no. Except maybe as just one more case in which, it is clear that Putin's nuclear rhetoric is one of the factors that, particularly in Washington, does hold them back from moves in support of Ukraine they might otherwise do. And it's probably not a coincidence that this happens while Washington is still deliberating over giving the Ukrainians permission to be able to use longer range missiles, ATACMS, Storm Shadows, and the like, against targets inside the Russian mainland. So, it might have a minor impact there. I think more this is actually preparations for the future and gives us a sense of how the Russians are thinking that things are likely to go. They're clearly anticipating some kind of informal ceasefire rather than a formal peace deal.
But is there any evidence that Putin would ever use nuclear weapons?
This is the question. I mean, the answer is probably not, because that's a slope that takes us to thermonuclear Armageddon. And look, Putin believes all kinds of crazy things and wicked things indeed, but there's no sense that he is suicidal. And in that context, both Western and Russian war games, which have tried to sort of play out how some kind of limited nuclear exchange can take place, all too often slide into something much, much more widespread. So I think that we should regard this as not so much preparation for nuclear operations, even the so-called non-strategic nuclear weapons, the smaller ones, which are kind of merely, quote unquote, sort of up to double the size of the bombs that were dropped on Nagasaki or Hiroshima. But, even their use is highly unlikely for reasons practical and political. But the point is, since we don't know that, nuclear weapons can be a very powerful mind game as well with the West and with Kyiv.
And it seems so far as if those mind games are working, because the fear of escalation has always been there, particularly in the White House. And the fact that last week we had Zelensky in New York at the UN General Assembly promoting his victory plan, one plank of which is believed to be seeking permission to use these long-range missiles inside Russia. And at the moment, President Biden doesn't seem to be budging on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's odd. I mean, I must admit, I've encountered quite a lot of consternation talking to, for example, British officials who essentially seem to have thought that it was pretty much a done deal. And that when Prime Minister Starmer was in Washington recently, that would be the moment at which this would be announced. And yet it didn't, and it still hasn't. And then there was expectations that when Zelensky was in the United States, that the Americans would use this as a suitable show-stealing moment to announce it, and they still haven't. However, one thing I would say is we tend to too often conflate escalation with nuclear use. Nuclear use is just part of the Russian escalatory package. There are other things they could do, from launching a mobilization wave, in other words, having more troops to actually prosecute their ground offensive, stepping up their sabotage attacks in Western Europe, even actually beginning to be much more unrestrained. I mean, hard to believe that the Russians have been at all restrained in their targeting, but they could, for example, essentially move their targeting much closer to the border with NATO. For example, trying to hit the railway lines that bring in, whether it's Western goodies or indeed Western politicians, into the country. So, I mean, I think that, yes, of course, it seems to have had some impact, but I think it's also as part of a much wider package of escalatory threats that the Russians are pointing towards.
And clearly Zelensky's very keen to be able to use these long-range missiles like the Storm Shadows and the Scalps inside Russia. But I mean, Ukraine is still having significant success using, for example, drones to strike targets inside Russia. Only yesterday, Ukrainian forces struck a Russian ammunition depot and missile storage facility in Volgograd Oblast. How much damage are those attacks doing to Russia?
I mean, they clearly are a distinct impact. And they've already begun to actually have an effect on the ammunition usage in the Donbass operation. However, the problem is, and this is why I think one of the reasons why those missiles are still regarded as very important, is, look, this is a constant war of adaptation. One side develops some new capability or shows some new tactic, and for a while, it's very successful. But then after a certain point, the other side works out how best to counter that. And I think there is some awareness with the Ukrainians. I mean, in fact, if one looks, they're having to launch these massive attacks, with 100 plus drones being used at a time, of which most actually get intercepted, jammed, otherwise shot down. So, there is the concern that at present they're being very effective, But the point is, already the Russians are dispersing some of their ammunition stocks, building even more sort of heavily armored shelters, acquiring new ways of spoofing or shooting down the drones and so forth. So yes, it's very effective, but the point is this is a constant war of imagination, and in this respect, fortunately, the Ukrainians have generally demonstrated themselves to be the winners in the imagination race. But in their own way, the Russians do adapt, and therefore we cannot assume that what they have done, what the Ukrainians have managed to do in the past few weeks, which has indeed been very successful, they will be able to continue to do ad infinitum.
And of course, one of the things that Zelensky's very keen to do is build up Ukraine's own defence industrial base. And we had some announcements last week, Denmark becoming the latest European country to announce fresh defence cooperation with Ukraine. They're going to establish a defence industrial hub at the Danish embassy in Kyiv. If you're Vladimir Putin, looking at that, looking at Ukraine building up its defence industrial base over the long term, how are you viewing that?
I mean, clearly it's a problem, but in some ways we have to go back to the fact that as far as Putin is concerned, he is not engaged in a war with Ukraine. He's engaged in a war with the West, in which Ukraine happens to be the battlefield. I mean, this is his kind of bizarre notion that he doesn't really want to give the Ukrainians any agency. He just sees them as the proxies of the evil conspiratorial West. So in some ways, he's already internalized this notion that he's having to fight his way through not only the Ukrainian population, but also the Western defense industrial complex. So in that respect, to a degree, this is just simply shifting the location. And from their point of view, so if it gets built in Ukraine, fine, maybe you have shorter supply lines. But essentially, it doesn't make a big deal for him whether actually a piece of kit or a piece of ammunition is built in the United States, in South Korea, in Denmark, or in Western Ukraine. And if anything, actually it opens up new possibilities. Because, if it's being produced in the West, then striking it would be an act of war. But if now it's actually being produced inside Ukraine, actually it becomes something that maybe he can target with his missiles or similar. So, again, I think from the Russians' point of view, unfortunately, some of these moves to them are irksome, but not necessarily especially significant. The real significance is in, as it were, the overall aggregate spend. Now, if the Russians think, look, this is money that the Danes, just to take that particular example, money that the Danes wouldn't have spent anyway, then it's different. If, on the other hand, you just simply think, well, look, the Danes would have spent this money, but instead of actually building something or providing something that was built in a Rheinmetall plant in Germany, it's instead going to be produced in a factory in Ukraine. From their point of view, what's the big deal? So I think we, again, it's a problematic thing because we don't truly know for certain ever what Putin genuinely thinks. But we have to do our best to try and crawl into those deep, dark recesses of his mind if we want to try and understand how the Russians are going to perceive what's happening.
Hello, it's James here. Sorry to interrupt this episode of Frontline, but I wanted to tell you about a new Times Radio channel on YouTube. It's called Times Radio History, and one of the things we love doing is looking back at some key turning points in history and asking ourselves what the long-term consequences would have been had they played out differently. We've covered D-Day, the Battle of Stalingrad, the Battle of Trafalgar, Gettysburg, and much more besides. And our most recent episode looks at the fateful Battle of Hastings in 1066. So, search for Times Radio History on YouTube and click subscribe. And of the apparent planks in Zelensky's victory plan, and we don't know the exact details, but is maybe the most important plank and the plank that Putin would be most concerned about, this idea of sustained military aid. So instead of this drip, feast or famine that we've seen over the course of the 2.5 years since the full-scale invasion so far, you would actually have a consistent flow of Western military aid to Ukraine. Is that what Putin fears the most?
Well, yes, because that takes away the vicissitudes of politics. Because from Putin's point of view, the single most, from his point of view, tempting point of weakness for the Ukrainians is precisely Western support. And, clearly this is to a large extent trying to Trump-proof that assistance. So that if Donald Trump does win the election, and if he means what he says about trying to impose a ceasefire, then that option is Well, not, I would say, completely off the table, because a president can always revoke what a previous president has agreed, but nonetheless a lot more complex and politically expensive to address. But the thing about this victory plan, and yes, it is unfortunate for those of us who are trying to pontificate about Ukraine that we haven't actually seen it. But nonetheless, those who have really are suggesting this is not so much a plan for victory against Russia, as in some ways a way of trying to actually lock in the West. I mean, I was speaking to a British diplomat who said, look, this is a shopping list, not a strategy. And I think this is one of the problems, because precisely Zelensky went there with a very sort of clear sense of what he wanted the West to provide. Everything from permission to use longer range missiles. I don't really want to call them long range because they're not that long range. Longer range missiles, a guaranteed sort of long-term supply, political support, and indeed NATO membership. All of which makes absolutely great sense from his point of view. But what he didn't really offer, as I understand it, again, all the caveats there, is actually precisely a clear sense of how that operationalizes. He knows where he wants to be. He knows where he wants Ukraine to be. He didn't really, and one can hardly blame him for this, but he didn't really provide a roadmap to how they get there. And I think that's why, in some ways, it failed to truly convince the Biden administration. Because it's all very well saying what you want, but if you can't actually give a convincing answer to how you're going to get there, then clearly there's hesitation about the support.
And we should mention, Mark, the day we're recording this, the 30th of September, is a somewhat significant date. Explain the significance.
Well, I mean, it's significant if you're looking at Russian government media, but I don't think significant for most Russians. It is notionally, it is the day of reunification. It is the anniversary day of the annexation of these 4 Ukrainian provinces, territories. And we've had Putin come out and give a speech. Interestingly, Putin has revived this term Novorossiya, New Russia, which is an old historical term for parts of eastern Ukraine. And back in 2014, when you had sort of various rebels and nationalists trying to use this term, the Kremlin absolutely did not want it to be used because it would kind of lock itself into a certain sort of policy position. But now, as ever, Putin will just simply scavenge through the history box for whatever he wants that will back his policies of the moment. So he has once again revived this term Novorossiya. And it's interesting because we are seeing a certain number of official events, particularly by regional leaders who want to curry favor. But really striking level of indifference on the part of ordinary Russians, which really brings home this point that, if one goes back to 2014, when Crimea was annexed, there was a very genuine degree of enthusiasm because Crimea was this part of Ukraine that, frankly, every Russian, whether they were Putin supporters or indeed his ardent critics, genuinely thought was rightfully Russian. I wouldn't say no one, but very few people really think that about, well, wherever, Melitopol or even Donetsk, quite frankly. So there is this attempt to kind of crank up a degree of enthusiasm, but in fact, all it's really doing at the moment is demonstrating actually the degree to which Russians, they may still well be patriots and they don't want to see Russia humiliated or defeated, but when it comes down to it, it's not really a war they care about.
And that point about Russian public opinion is crucial. I mean, it's interesting. The Institute for the Study of War are reporting today that Putin is, as we shouldn't be surprised, going to look at defense spending increases for 2025, but is trying to kind of downplay that and play up increases in social spending. And is that because he is conscious that there is a risk if ordinary Russians feel as if their living standards are suffering to fund this war in Ukraine?
Yes, and of course, it's worth noting that in many cases, their living standards are already suffering and will suffer much more in the course of this war. Yes, it really sort of is a pattern that we've seen through the course of this year. I mean, earlier this year, for example, Putin very explicitly said to the Russian people, we will not repeat the mistakes made by the Soviet Union. In other words, that point at which the Soviet Union had concentrated so much on guns rather than on butter that essentially it spent itself into economic collapse. And it's worth noting that at its peak in peacetime, obviously wartime was even higher, but if at its peak in the late 70s, Soviet Union was spending twice as much a proportion of GDP on defense as today's Russia. So in that context, the slightly depressing conclusion is that there's a certain amount of room that can go. But of course, that was a very different time and a very different political situation. And today's Russians, they have memories of what their lives were like a few years ago. They have memories of what it was like when, not only could you be pretty certain that next year was going to be a more prosperous year for you than last year, but also you could, travel on holiday to the West and buy all sorts of Western goods without having to pay the additional surcharge to have it smuggled in, and not have to worry about your iPhone not getting updated and all the other sort of what might sound petty and small scale limitations on their lives, but which are very real ones. So I think in this context, yes, Putin has to continue to try and play the idea that this is a war that Russia, on the one hand, has to take seriously because it's some kind of grand existential struggle for its place in the world and so forth, because he needs to talk it up to justify the sacrifices. But on the other hand, he's also trying to have to talk it down and say, yeah, it's an existential struggle, but it's no big deal. And don't worry, and everything's going to be fine and so forth. There is a tension there that, frankly, that Putin and the state are not really managing all that well. And so you have the legions of technocrats who are just trying to manage the country as best they can, constantly struggling against the demands and dictates of the Kremlin and of the war. And so far, they have done, one has to recognize, actually a pretty good job of that. But as we see, for example, the central bank raising the base rates higher and higher, as we see inflation mounting, as we see labor pressures also increasingly great, and even as we see, the police are saying that depending on which location you're in, they're currently a quarter to a third under strength, simply because they can't recruit, because they're having to compete with the much higher salaries that are not just being paid by people who go and serve in the army, but even, frankly, people who then go and serve in defense industries, all of which are now having to offer enough money to attract sort of spare labor. So that sort of knocks on into sense of law and order. There's a rising crime rate, even before one factors in returning soldiers, scarred, traumatized, used to violence. We're similarly seeing, for example, paramedics. Paramedics are under strength, again, because you can go and be a medic in the army and double your salary. So, for all of this, actually, bit by bit, this war is absolutely eating into not just the fat, but the basic meat and sinews of the Russian state and social provision. But the point is that tends to be a lagging indicator. So at the moment, Putin is still slightly protected because it's not as if suddenly, bang, hospitals that don't have cleaners sort of have to be closed or whatever. No, it's just that they're just not as good, and people may well have more of a chance of catching MRSA or whatever else. But bit by bit, this is exactly how the Soviet Union slid into dissolution. But I have to say, in keeping with the modern times, it's on fast forward. Soviet Union could basically last 15 years before Gorbachev's attempts at reforms actually doomed it, and quite possibly could have lasted longer if it had a rather different type of leader. This kind of degradation, there's no way that it can go on for 20 years.
Well, on that note, I wanted to get your thoughts on an interview that the recently freed Russian dissident Vladimir Kara-Murza gave to the Times only last week, in which he said that Putin's demise could come about when we least expected and potentially come around far more quickly than people think. What do you make of that, Mark?
I'm going to sit on the fence in some ways. On the one hand, look, he's absolutely right that we have to recognize the degree to which we are often very bad at predicting when these kind of authoritarian regimes finally break, because it tends to be a break. It's not a slow slide. It's suddenly things reach a kind of a critical mass of crisis, and all of a sudden people act. And if one looks, for example, at the elite, at the moment, of course, there is no question of any kind of serious elite coup or whatever against Putin, because the risks in doing so massively outweigh the risks in doing nothing. But on the other hand, we also have to accept this is an elite which is not a Putinist elite. These are not people who are kind of passionately committed to him as a man. They are just simply ruthless, self-interested opportunists who are constantly doing these cost-benefit analyses. And the result of that is, if something happened in the future, mass protests, economic collapse, whatever, that made enough of them change their mind, then momentum would probably swing against Putin. And that could happen very quickly. So on one level, I think Vladimir Kara-Murza is absolutely right. And look, this is a man who not only sort of understands from the real bowels of this system how it works, but also he's a historian. And he understands also Russia's historical trajectory and how regimes have collapsed quite unexpectedly and quickly. But the only little caveat I would throw in is that to some people, that can sometimes be an excuse. And I'm not saying this is obviously his intent, but to some people, this can be an excuse to basically think, well, we don't have to worry too much about this because, this is a regime which is inevitably going to fall. And suddenly, there will be this deus ex machina. And surely some sort of Democrats will come to power and then everything will be happy and nice. Of course, it's not necessarily going to be like that. Anyway, I mean, whoever comes to power after Putin, although I am unfashionably optimistic that it's not going to be a sort of a Putin 2.0, nor is it going to be a Kara-Murza or a Navalny. It's going to be someone from within the existing elite who will have good reasons to want to improve relations with the West and try and dial down the tensions just for their own pragmatic reasons. But they will still be self-interested kleptocrats. But as I said, given we don't know when it's going to be, we don't know exactly what the trajectory is going to be, we don't know who's going to emerge as a result, we can't really operate on that principle. If that happens, that happens. When it happens, that'll be great. But here and now, in some ways, we have to assume, just as Putin seems to assume, that he's going to be there forever and build our policies accordingly.
Mark Galeotti, always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Good to talk.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.